I'm not sure if I'm overexposed or if I am just pale. Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla and I like to talk about books, and I'm also really bad at intros, so that's the situation. Today I'm going to be talking about the book Maid, Hard Work, Low Pay, and a Mother's Will to Survive by Stephanie Land. And you've probably heard a lot about this recently because they just released a series on Netflix based on this book. This is a memoir. It's sort of a fictionalized version of this story, and I'll talk a little bit about comparing them because I actually watched the short limited series on Netflix first, and that's what prompted me to read the book. Both I thought were good. Both had some really strong points, but obviously this one is a memoir. It's true. Maid, the Netflix series, is a fictionalized account, so we'll talk about some of those differences, but I really want to talk about this book. I actually have a lot of thoughts on it, especially from a mother's perspective. This is a mother's perspective, so yeah, I have a lot to say about this, so if you're interested in my review on this, then definitely keep watching. If not, that's okay. Maid chronicles Stephanie Land's experience as a single mother and trying to climb out of poverty after leaving an emotionally abusive relationship with her really young daughter. She gets pregnant accidentally from like a summer fling basically, and that kind of forces people who weren't otherwise gonna stay together to kind of stay together and realize that like they weren't a good fit, they weren't bringing out the best in each other. Her boyfriend was definitely like had some emotionally abusive tendencies, and so she left with her young daughter, who I think was just a baby at the time, and basically was like trying to make a better life. So this book chronicles her time working for obviously extremely low wages, trying to climb out of poverty, and at the same time she's like going to school, going to community college, and eventually dreams of attending a creative writing program in Montana, which she does attend. I'm gonna talk about this book pretty openly. There's not a lot of spoiling it really, because like obviously we know that the ending turned out well and she became a writer because she wrote this book, so I'm not really spoiling that much honestly if I talk about it pretty openly, which I will. I think that this was a really good depiction of the day-to-day emotional toll that it takes to be living in poverty, working for such low wages, such hard work for such low wages. There's no safety net really. There aren't like the benefits that you need to survive. This is a really good emotional account of that. I definitely went on to GOODREADS and read some of the reviews for this book actually before I read it, and I was not totally surprised, but there were quite a few reviews that were honestly pretty scathing, comparing it to Nickel and Dimed, which is another amazing book by Barbara Ehrenreich. And Barbara Ehrenreich actually wrote the foreword to this, which, I mean, love her. That was Nickel and Dimed was an incredible book, but I think that comparing the two of them is right off the bat just a mistake. This is a different type of book. In Nickel and Dimed, Barbara Ehrenreich was going undercover, so to speak. I mean, she was like an investigative journalist, so she wasn't really living the actual toll in poverty, and she didn't have a child to take care of. So I think that when you compare the two and you say, well, this isn't really citing a lot of facts and figures, it's a memoir. It's an emotional account. It's not here to cite facts and figures. It's not here to convince you of the same things that Nickel and Dimed was here to convince you of. This is just an emotional account of one woman's experience, and I think that it's important to keep that in mind because I saw a lot of comparisons, unfavorable comparisons of this book to Nickel and Dimed, but Nickel and Dimed is just a completely different type of book in my opinion. I enjoyed this, but I am not without criticism. I think that there are even some parts where I was like, oh, I probably would have edited that. I think that there are some chronology issues a little bit with the story. Can we all point to things that she maybe didn't do perfectly or that we ourselves would not do in that situation? Sure. But I also think that this just highlights what this book in general highlights, which is that there is no room in this country. If you live in poverty, there's no room for you to make a single mistake, to be even the tiniest bit selfish, or even sometimes give self-love. There's really not room for that. And instead of saying, oh, you're poor, you don't have the wages, you shouldn't have spent it on that, maybe we should be wondering why we think that people should never have a treat their entire lives. Like why we think that nobody should ever have something nice just because they don't make very much money. I don't think it's fair to criticize every little action like that. I think we need to be looking at the bigger picture, which is, would we be criticizing that if somebody who worked just as many hours but was paid more, would we be criticizing that of that person as well? So that's something that kind of bothered me. What shocked me was how many of the Goodreads reviews were just not even necessarily reviewing the book, but reviewing like her choices kind of, and it just felt like there wasn't always a lot of sympathy and empathy there. That being said, I do think that she came off much more likable in the show, which is obviously, as I said, a fictionalized account. So the show felt like a more cohesive story because it was fictionalized version of reality. This story was a good story. It's worth reading, and as a mother, a lot of the parts of just surviving really spoke to me. I mean, I honestly can't imagine the bravery, and I myself have been in a physically and emotionally abusive relationship before, and I mean, it was hard to leave, and I didn't have a child, and I did have like a job, and I did have a way to leave that. This just highlights to me how vulnerable stay-at-home moms are, stay-at-home caretakers are. It highlights to me what a vulnerable position women and all people are in when they stay at home and kind of give up that connection to the world and some of that financial ability. And I mean, it made me feel more vulnerable reading it because I'm in that position of staying at home with a baby, and I understand how now I'm realizing how vulnerable that really is, and especially if you have a spouse that's like limiting access to funds. It's actually kind of a scary concept to think about leaving, and it's a scary concept to think about leaving even if you do have a little bit more stability or capability. To anybody who thinks it's very easy to get government assistance, for a lot of people in situations where they need it, it is not easy. And part of the reason it's not easy is if you're fleeing an abusive conflict or situation, you might not have access to everything you need. You might not have a job because maybe you were staying home. You might not have pay stubs from a job because you've been staying home taking care of a baby. You might not have a lot of those things. So it's really interesting how vulnerable some people are in our society and how few protections we have for them. I'm gonna kind of get right into comparing a little bit of the book and the show. I'm gonna say right off the bat, my feelings about the book are so mixed that I don't know if I have like a straight up 4 or 5 star that I can give it, but I do think it's an important read for a lot of people, and I think it's generally well written. It's conflicted for me. I have mixed feelings about it. But that being said, I want to compare it a little bit to the show because I think that the show actually portrayed the cycle of abuse a lot better, and they clearly polished things up to make sure that that was a theme of the show, that domestic violence and abuse were what were kind of highlighted more in the show. It's actually not really even talked about that much in the book. So I was a little disappointed when I watched the limited series first, and it was such a really great depiction of what it's like to go through domestic violence, to go through abuse. It rang very true to me and my own experience, and the idea too of like a lot of people who have not been through something like that really struggle with why would you go back to that person. Looking from the outside in, I used to be one of those people before I went through it, and then I was in that relationship and I left and I went back and I left and I went back. I don't love talking about it because it makes me feel a little bit like people will think I'm weak or but the reality is when you're in an abusive relationship, even if it hasn't gotten physical yet, the early signs are that you'll really get cut off from a lot of your other resources and support systems. So your self-worth, your emotional connections are all wrapped up kind of in this one person. So when that person does something bad to you, you say it's your fault, or you stay anyway because, oh, but there's this, and that. There's other parts of your self-worth and your value that are so wrapped up in them because you've gotten cut off from your other relationships. Or maybe you leave and then you realize that you don't have other people. or you try to talk to people about it, maybe they don't believe you. That was my experience as well. So then I went back. And that's without even having a child. So I can't imagine with a child how hard it was. And I think that the limited series actually depicted that really well. In the series, the fictionalized version of Stephanie Alex, she does end up going back with her boyfriend. And that actually doesn't happen in the real life memoir, or at least she doesn't talk about it. Maybe it happened in real life, but they do depict it in the show. And I thought that was really, I liked the way they did that. And I liked the way they had the support systems at the DV shelter where she was, where they were kind of, she's like, well, why would you go back? Why would you go back? And then she ended up being a person who went back, because it's so easy to look at that, and say, like, why would you go back to that? But then suddenly everything's sliding back on you. You realize you don't have the resources you need outside of that relationship. Then actually it becomes really easy and really simple to go back to that. This isn't a book really about domestic violence or abuse or any of those things. It's a book about kind of the aftermath of the leaving. But it was interesting that the series focused on that, and then the memoir itself actually didn't focus on it that much. So I'd be curious to see if she'd ever write anything more in depth about this. Maybe it was like too painful to write about. Maybe it just wasn't the story she was trying to tell. I don't know her level of involvement in the limited series either, so maybe she was very involved in the limited series, maybe she wasn't. I don't know how much she shaped that narrative or provided any insight, but that's something that I wish would have been covered more in the book. I would definitely say it's worth a read if you're interested in the subject matter, and I would actually probably recommend the limited series on Netflix before I would recommend the book, because the limited series on Netflix does a better job of depicting domestic violence, and I just felt like it was honestly a lot more polished. One issue that I had with this book was that she leapt around a little bit with chronology, and it kind of sometimes made it confusing about the order in which things occurred, which of course it's not maybe the most important thing in the world, it's just the general story. The chronology was a little funky. There were a couple sentences where I would have liked an editor to go over that a little bit more carefully. But overall, it's a good book. It's worth a read if you're interested. If you're not interested, you're just not gonna like it. I don't even know what to rate it. 4 maybe? 4 stars? 3.5 stars? 4 stars? It was good. It was engaging. You know, it's not the most uplifting book, but it's got a great ending. She pulls herself out. She kind of hits that dream in the end. So yeah, if you're interested, read it. If you're not, don't. That's gonna be it for this review. Please let me know below if you've watched the limited series or if you've read the book, or both, because I'd be curious to see other people who have read it and watched it, which you prefer. Because this is I think the first time I've ever preferred a series or a TV show over the book. Crazy. I never thought that would happen in my whole life, but I liked it better. Anyway, let me know below what your thoughts are. That's gonna be it. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe. I'll see you later.